So hello, everybody. Welcome to Dangerous PH, where we have dangerous conversations talking about data privacy, data ethics, free speech, and the fourth industrial revolution as it approaches our world. I have with me, I'm Kevin Levers. I have with me Dr. Wes Smith and Chris nAndor, who is a developer and a journalist. Don't hold that against him. And he has a book and a project coming out called Don't Trust, Verify. And so, Wes, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hope you guys can hear me. My name is Wes Smith. I'm a Brainpool Scientific Fellow in Seoul, Korea at two institutions now, at KIST, that's the Korea Institute for Science and Technology, and Korea University Medical School. And I got my PhD from UCLA, and I study all manner of electrophysiological correlates of consciousness and how we can use large-scale recording mechanisms to understand the brain a bit better in mice and mouse tissue, mouse slice, that sort of thing. And I have various concerns about how science is conducted, suffice to say, especially since the last 2 years. And prior to my current position, I was in the pharmaceutical industry as a scientist at Amgen. And so I have somewhat of an idea of how these things work, and it's alarming.
Okay.
Not to slide Amgen, but just the whole general pharma complex.
So you were behind the secret of NIM. Sorry about that, buddy.
You're dating yourself.
We should say that nothing that I say constitutes the opinion of my employers or my funding agencies.
Exactly. None of this conversation is for open discussion. We are free speech masters. This does not represent in any way, shape, or form our sponsors, our employers. Chris, tell us about yourself.
Well, I want to correct you. I'm not a journalist. Oh. I do have a degree in journalism, but I'm not a professional journalist, and I haven't been really ever. And that's actually part of why I wrote the book. So yeah, the book is called Don't Trust, Verify. It's obviously riffing on, when Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. And I think that's wrongheaded. No one needs our trust. I mean, well, they want our trust and they will exploit our trust. So my whole thing is don't give them our trust. And this is a part of the book that, so the book is about how it's really a media literacy book, how to consume the media, news media in particular. And I say in the book that I'm really not trying to fix the media, because I think this is probably a lost cause. So we just have to figure out how we can, but we live in the world with this media, and so we have to figure out a way to deal with it. And so that's primarily what it's about. It's giving people tools, and including some history, including kind of learning about how humans work, because if we don't know how humans work, we can't understand how the media works. So it gets into a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of psychology, but then the bulk of the book is just giving people tools for how to read and how to consume the news media, which is lying to us all the time.
All right. So, Wes, do you want to start this off with any questions? I figured I'd let you do that. You're also a software developer, correct, Chris?
Yes. Yeah. I'm a software developer. I write a lot, and I've always written a lot. So I got my degree, but I decided I didn't want to go into journalism because I hate the journalism business.
You are the literal example of learn to code for a journalist.
Exactly. And so I got banned once because I told a journalist to learn to code. So Twitter suspended me. I'm like, I'm just giving people the advice that I took myself. So how can you ban me for giving good career advice that worked for me?
Yeah, it's quite lucrative. You're helping them out quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, of course, I don't really want them to learn to code, because most journalists don't have the cognitive abilities to be good software developers, and they'll just make my life worse if they're in the same business as I am.
Good thing you've never read my code. So this is a really softball, I suppose, but what sort of chain of events made you want to write the book? Because at least for me, my sort of switch kind of flipped. I mean, it's been progressively flipping for the course of my life, but
Yeah.
the last 2 years really made me, turn on myself mentally and realize that a lot of what I had taken for granted about inside academics was like how things ought to be done. But then, things happened, and I realized maybe I should re-examine my presuppositions about this stuff. And so for me, it's like the last 2 years. But for you, so probably maybe something deeper, longer ago?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to when I first was going to college back in 91. I was a freshman journalism major, and this was the beginnings of Bill Clinton's run to become president, and the whole thing with him and Jennifer Flowers, and how the media was kind of basically burying that as much as they could. And maybe, a lot of people might not remember, but Bill Clinton had an affair basically with Jennifer Flowers, and this was and it came out, I think it was in 91 that it first came out, and this dogged him throughout the 92 campaign. And around the same time, there was Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And those two stories were covered so differently, where Clarence Thomas is nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, and there were allegations about him, and the press did everything they could to push those allegations. And once it became clear that Bill Clinton was kind of the chosen front runner, the press did everything they could to kind of bury Jennifer Flowers and her story. So that's kind of where I first said, hey, wait a minute. But I did go on to get my degree, and I was like, obviously there's some problems. There's problems in every industry. But then I got to this point where I just kind of hated myself when I was a lot of times covering stories, because I was bothering people. I was out there just to get a quote, just to get something so I could make a story. And I realized there was just something fundamentally wrong with journalism, where it became, it was just like you're out there to just get something so people will read it, instead of trying to give people what is actually useful or newsworthy. And that has gotten so much worse, obviously, with the internet and 24-hour cable news, where it's just constant. It's just they'll do everything they can to deceive you, to get you to click. And so it hasn't been one thing. It's, for me, it's been 30 years of watching. But what got me kind of probably the thing that made me want to write the book was, over the past few years, there's really been a push, especially with social media and Facebook, and all these experts who were advising Facebook about what is and isn't disinformation and misinformation, and they were trying to inform Facebook users about media literacy and how to spot things that are trustworthy. And I see it all the time. People say, well, one of the first things you can do when you're trying to spot something that might not be trustworthy is look at the source. Is it from a respectable, reputable news organization? I said, that is completely wrongheaded. That's CNN, Fox, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. They all get stuff wrong all the time. You can't trust them just because it's a reputable news organization. And even if they get something wrong, you might never know, even if they print a retraction. So I started thinking, I just hate a lot of the advice that's given to people for how to be media literate. So maybe I should start writing something about how to be media literate. So that's what's kind of the genesis of this over the past several years, just seeing what the media getting worse and wanting people to have good tools for how to consume it. So that's the bottom line there.
I think the big elephant standing behind us all is, how do you become media literate? Tell us,
Yeah. So I'll kind of maybe take you through a little bit of the outline of the book. And it starts off with just giving a history of yellow journalism in particular, and then getting into the motives of why it was the way it was. And this is 100 years ago. when you had the two big newspapers in New York. Hearst in particular, he was the most egregious, but Pulitzer was his competitor. And, it was mostly about just trying to get people to read it. And so they'd be extremely sensationalistic. There was one particular, probably the most famous incident, and it wasn't one specific thing, but it was over the course of months. Both of the newspapers, but Hearst in particular, were trying to stoke anger against Spain and their treatment of Cubans, because Spain controlled Cuba at the time, and they're really trying to push people into war. And there's debates today about how much the newspapers actually contributed to us ending up going to war. But there's many stories, and I include a couple of them in the book, of just the papers printing things that were untrue or unfounded just to get people to be angry, and for the dual purpose of trying to get people to buy the newspaper and trying to fulfill their agenda of going on to war. There's one where a woman was, she was on a ship under a US flag, and they thought she was a spy, and so they ended up searching her. The headlines made it seem like just these Spanish soldiers, and there was a political cartoon in the paper showing these soldiers leering at her as she's being undressed to be searched, and it made people livid. What actually happened is that it was females who took her into a separate room and searched her, and they did it respectfully, but that wasn't included in the news report.
Right.
Yeah. And then the most famous incident was USS Maine. There was an explosion, and it sank off the coast of Cuba, and they blamed Cuba for this. It turns out it was probably that some fumes ignited inside the ship through no fault of the Cubans. Although to this day, we're not sure exactly what happened.
Right.
But so, and we, of course, these are examples of things that happened. In, the news made it seem like, why did the Cubans sink our ship instead of?
Right. You can also fast forward to the Gulf of Tonkin incident that started Vietnam.
Yeah. Yep. It's goes on throughout, and it's gone through ebbs and flows, but it's never stopped, and it's always been that way. I mean, you can go back to the beginning of our republic, and the sensationalism there. So understanding kind of the history of it, and then the motivations. What is the motivation of a news producer? Again, it's to get clicks, it's to sell papers, it's to push agendas. What are the motivations of the news makers, the politicians, the police, whoever you're covering as a reporter? What are their motivations? Sometimes their motivation is to just inform the public. Sometimes it's to get you to vote for them. Sometimes it's to cover up a crime.
Right.
And then of course, and pride, ego has a lot to do with all of this. And then what are your motivations as a news consumer? What are you trying to get out of the news? And so I'm spending quite a bit of time in the book, which I don't have a date for when the book is going to be ready, but I'm hoping for this year. But what are you trying to get out of the news? If you're trying to be informed, then you need to figure out how do you get the true information. If you're just trying to get fodder to attack your political rival, which is what a lot of people do when they're reading the news, then this book really might not be for you, because you're already getting what you want out of the news today.
Or the people might want to virtue signal. They might want to say they're familiar with certain more trending topics, and they have a very baseline fluency in that idea, and so they can just repeat that opinion and then in-group signal to others, right? So it's a sort of an agreeableness check amongst your cohort.
That's absolutely right.
Home saves lives, right?
There's one section of the book where I'm talking about how different people are motivated kind of by different things, and some people really their primary motivation for most of what they do is how they're seen by their peers. And so when they approach a topic, they're trying to figure out what is the right opinion to have. And the news story will tell them what the right opinion is to have if they're reading it from the news source that is approved of by their peers. And I think that's why sometimes people get so mad when, and it happens on both the right and the left. After the election last time, you had hosts and guests on Fox News who were really criticizing Trump and his people who were saying the election was stolen. They're saying, no, the election wasn't stolen. You don't have the evidence to back this up. And the Fox viewers, a whole bunch of them left and still haven't come back because they didn't want to hear that opinion. And so that's another motivation of the news producers, right? They want to make sure that they don't lose their audience,
right?
And say things that, so even if you're sitting in the newsroom and go, man, this is just such a stupid story, but if we say that, we're going to lose half our viewers,
right?
So it's really tough all around. But at the end of the day, if you realize these things, if you're truly woke in terms of what the media is trying to feed you, you'll be looking for things. You'll be looking for, okay, one of the most fundamental things is, where did you get that piece of information that you're telling me? So you say, here's another example from Fox News right before Trump was elected in 2016. Brett Baer, who's an extremely well-respected news journalist on Fox News, he said that sources, he didn't say who, sources are reporting that Hillary Clinton is about to be indicted. And it never happened. It was a bogus leak. He apologized for it on the air. I think it was the next night. But a lot of people believed it. And I heard that and I didn't believe it. And because I just said, where are you getting that information? Says who?
Right.
And he couldn't tell me, so I withheld belief. And I think the most important thing that someone can do who's consuming the news and they want to have true beliefs about what's actually happening is they're willing to say, I don't know. So I read a story, I'm not convinced, and so I withhold belief. Just be prepared to withhold belief and say you don't know. And that's an extremely powerful tool if you really want to. And as a scientist, I mean, that's bread and butter, right? You form your hypothesis, you do your tests. At the end of the day, sometimes you just don't know, and that's okay. It means you go back to the drawing board.
Wes has an interesting concept of truth, right? What is truth? And go ahead, Wes.
Oh boy. Basically, the reality is constructed of Bayesians, just Bayesians just going into more Bayesians. And so we have an idea about how the world works because our ideas have stood the test of multiple experiments, and they are logically sound, and logic being both the artifice and then the intrinsic sign of causality in the world. It's a lot to unpack, but
yeah,
when you have things like mathematics, which are empirically valid if you establish the right linguistic framework for it, which is arguably already within us mentally, sort of like the truthful way to pursue these things necessarily unfolds so long as you do it openly through dialogue.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, that's a lot to unpack, but supposing that 2 + 2 = 4, given that we know what 2 and 2 are, and we can empirically verify what those things are, and notice I'm saying the word empirically verify, we can establish all manner of things such as the rest of mathematics, physics, and then through exploration of the natural world, we can develop technology, and we develop better heuristics to understand, okay, the sun rises. Well, what does that mean that the sun rises? Can we take better measurements for these things and expand through multiple domains to figure out, okay, what concepts are associated with that, so that I understand it's not that necessarily the sun rises per se. That's just a figure of speech that we've used throughout history. But in actuality, we turn around the sun and rotate around it. And we've discovered that, right? And that's a lot of the things that we say are mostly figures of speech. There's always a deeper and more nuanced meaning to these things. That's just one example of them. But like when we talk about scientific observations, we talk about facts these days, like fact checking. But then in actuality, a scientific paper is mostly just someone's opinions associated with their observations that are empirical usually.
Yeah.
But that's subject to human artifice, human training, human error, human interpretation,
Right.
human bias. I'm not saying that all scientists are liars, but there is an incentive to do things in a certain way. If you have a certain idea about how the world works, you can only advance the scientific field if you pursue that story. Like for example, if Einstein has an idea about the general relativity, he actually has to throw out certain mathematical theorems to make it work, right? And that's why you have people like Eric Weinstein and the people who taught him and informed him why they want to improve on that, right? Not that I understand everything that Weinstein says, but this is just an example that Einstein is not the be all end all of general relativity, and that there are actually problems with it. There are generally very many things that are useful from it, though, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a best approximation of reality. And that's what I'm saying, is that when we have a model for a neural circuit, it's a best approximation for how that works. And that's why we're experimenting on it, because we can use what we know or what we think we know and throw it at it to understand it a little bit better, right? And so I often use the term, or the classical allegory of like blind men touching an elephant, figuring out how to describe the elephant best. We're all using equipment and reagents and ideas that we are trained on using to the best of our ability. It's not always great though, because we're measuring something by proxy, right? Like when I record a neuron, I don't actually see the neuron necessarily, and I don't see the sodium ions flowing or things like that. I'm measuring signal voltage change by proxy, and so I can interpret things based off of that. That's how all science is. You're measuring something by proxy with your hypothesis as sort of a guiding principle, and you learn, does this jive with reality or not? And that's my take, that everyone's basically telling stories, and they have a certain level of fitness.
And that's how good journalism is also conducted. I'm not saying, if I'm writing a news story, you shouldn't be saying as a reporter, X died yesterday at 2:48 p.m. You say, according to police, right, X died at 2:40. Right? We can't independently verify that that's actually who died at that time. Right. But we can.
It's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah. Right. We can report what we know, which is that the police told us this. There's a great quote. So a bunch of the book, especially in the first parts of the book, where I'm kind of giving history and philosophy about journalism, I'm heavily referencing Walter Lippmann, who 100 years ago, it's funny because he wrote about the extremely poor reporting in the New York Times about Russia. And here we are, almost exactly 100 years later, and not much has changed. But he said, it does not matter that the news is not susceptible of mathematical statement. In fact, just because news is complex and slippery, good reporting requires the exercise of the highest of the scientific virtues.
Nice.
I thought you might like that quote.
Very much so.
What's interesting is Wes and Chris, you mentioned something, and you're talking about what is their motivation. Yeah. And so what I see now is the weaponization of our pillars, right? So Fourth Estate was always lauded as the pillar of our society that kept power in check, right? Speak, truth, power, democracy dies in darkness, and all that stuff. But what it's actually become is yet another weapon of power. And what was the statement that Orwell said? Power is not a means, it's the end, right? So what we're looking at is it's all about to create narratives in a post-truth subjective world, and program individuals to react emotionally versus the higher faculties of discernment. Remember, George Carlin always said they're not going to, the education is to dumb you down, right? They're not going to give you the education you need.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I see that unfolding in front of us. It's almost like the Pentecostal pastors that I had in my youth in the 80s, who I thought were crazy, are more like the prophets, because everything's happening in front of us. And so in terms of fact checking, let me revert to John Stossel's finding about him getting fact checked and how he sued. The dude the dude chased the guy down to France. You know what I mean? And he found out that they're just NGOs that somebody knows somebody. They get a job at Facebook or in the InSocMed, and they all cross-reference each other. So
Yeah.
have you had any experience like the John Stossel story that I just gave in this example of how fact-checking is really just motivated by narrative control, and it's all kind of tied to a global message? You see where I'm going?
Yeah. I don't think I have any examples with fact checking off the top of my head. Although, I mean, every time I see the fact checkers decide to weigh in on something, I just know it's going to be sad and awful. But
I mean, one of the good examples is what was it? One of the board members of Reuters is also what was it? Reuters and Pfizer are connected. Yeah. So Reuters fact check is in the
on
palm
each
of
other's
Pfizer.
boards. They're on each other's boards.
Yeah. It's entirely ridiculous. Sometimes it has a partisan slant, sometimes it doesn't. But I just read one the other day, and again, I can't think of the specific example off the top of my head, but they were fact checking whether Biden said XYZ, and he did. He said it, and their fact check was false. And it's like, well, it was false because he didn't actually mean it, or it's missing context.
Right.
But he said it. So let's start with it is true, but their goal is not to inform us. Their goal is to convince us of what they want us to believe. And we see this all the time, and it makes me furious, just kind of, as someone who's has a degree in journalism, but also is a consumer of the news. It's like, I just want someone to be straight with me. Just tell me what the facts are. And that's not how it goes. But I do have go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned earlier one of your heuristics for determining if something is close to realistic or close to fact-based is, who said it, right? And I have really realized that in terms of science journalism, you can easily just say something, and then the journalist could just say, oh, well, this lab said it. You're going to doubt that lab? Are you a better scientist than them? And so that sort of veneer of authority based off of assumed logic is very, very difficult.
I have a really funny story on that
to get past. Yeah, I have my opinion about that, but I want to hear what you have to think about that.
There was this. I'm trying to remember the name of the publication, but they, I think it was NPR. NPR has so many terrible examples, but I was looking through some of my archives of things, just as a quick aside of just bad examples of bad, and it's like a majority of them were NPR. It was really bizarre, but there was this one story where a reporter said that a round from an AR-15 can decapitate someone. And I said,
potentially. Wait, from an AR-15?
I mean,
not
really.
If their neck is
hanging
off by a single string.
Yeah. And so I'm like, where did they get this from? And they referenced, they said, according to this article, which was according to, and I tracked it down like 2 or 3 levels deep, and it ended up referencing a study from the Pentagon from the 60s, where they were talking to Vietnam soldiers and trying to figure out how this new M16 was performing in the field. And there was one soldier who gave an anecdote that it blew a guy's head off. And that's where they get it from.
Wow.
Very, very accurate.
And so here we are 50 plus years later, and the news is just asserting, without any real evidence at all, that a round from an AR-15 can decapitate someone.
That is some weaponized autism right there.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. But this is the state of journalism.
That's good. That's good. This is really an interesting conversation. I'm really glad that we had it. What I want to talk about, I guess, now is where do you think this is headed? We all know that there's an obvious push, and let's just, paint it as it is. There's this global drumbeat that's pushing to, a global unicorn post nation state world, and that's a secular religion, with its own idols and its own pretenses and its own language and its own dialectic. And in part of that, I guess, religion that is, for lack of a better term, post, woke progressivism, it's like the ends justify the means. So when you're dealing with a society, and this is what cracks me up about the whole attack of like fundamentalist Christians or whatever they call it, because they don't look at themselves and understand that they're also in a religion, right? And that their religion is that this is the only way to do things, right? When there's multiple ways to do things, and you should just let people raise their kids, go to school the way they want, focus on these things, not the outcomes you want. So knowing that there is a movement that is global, that is part of this drive to get, and you know what? God bless them. I understand they want to have a better future. I understand it. So you have the, more or less the conservative, normal people, leave us alone, we'll build our own lives. And you have the people that are bound and determined to cause World War III and reshape the earth in their vision. How do we, knowing that these are the immovable object and the immovable force coming together, how do we communicate honestly and openly when we know they're duplicitous and they're commies? So,
yeah. Well, let me start by saying I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but in this case, especially in the last few years, they've been really open about, what the whole one world government stuff. They really do want to have centralized control over everything. And it's not much of a leap just from what we see going on in the press to their agenda. I think there's a lot of the people who run the news media who are part of that agenda. And, again, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just like, at Davos, I mean, they're open about it, and they're actually are close friends with the people who are controlling our media in a lot of cases. The CEOs of the news organizations and the presidents and the the executives there. So I think more and more, and not because of that stuff, but just more and more people are just extremely dissatisfied with what they're seeing in the news media, and people are turning it off and looking for alternative sources. I'm hoping that these sources that are going to be cropping up over the next how many ever years are more reliable. I'm not a pessimist, but I also am a realist. I try to be realistic, and I don't know if it's going to happen. I think that things are going to get a lot worse with media before they get better. And people are, when they're trying to push back against, and we see it right when COVID and all of the madness came out about that, and people trying to force us into and lying to us constantly about vaccines, about masks, and people pushed back with their own wrong information. We saw people talking about vaccines having computer chips in them, and there was the story that's still common today about Bill Gates saying that he wanted to use vaccines to sterilize people, when what he was really saying was that he said that vaccine would lead to reduced population growth, but what he was talking about was that if you had a healthier family, people in third world are going to have fewer children because they often will have more children because they know some of them aren't going to survive. So that was his point. But people said, "Oh, what he really meant by." Yeah, go ahead.
It's funny because these sort of things are not necessarily fixed by vaccination, but they're rather fixed by better public health, better sanitation, better water
And he saw
quality.
vaccine. as part of that, but not as the exclusive.
It's like it's an
means.
easy. The thing is, these things are quote unquote easy fixes because you can just give shots to people and call it a day, and you think you've done something. But in actuality, having waterworks and good agriculture, good food practices, these sort of things are much more. It's a long-term process that you have to maintain, right? It's not a trivial thing. So like
and whether Gates has whether he was overemphasizing vaccines or not, he wasn't saying that vaccines are going to sterilize people.
Right. But, sure. I'm just commenting on his idea of public health, and his idea of benefiting people would be the canonical Western idea of one and done, and you can get on with your life, whereas your life actually needs to reorient around the healthy way of life, right? Like that's the whole thing. It's not just like one intervention, it's like constant interventions.
That's one of the things that I have found out about living in Asia is they treat the body and the reason for the disease, not just giving you medicine, right? So even you go to the doctors and they're like, what's your diet? You're acidic, you got to do this, you got to stop that, stop sugar, and they go through this entire, if you did that in the West, from what I understand now, it's like, you're fat shaming me, being ableist, or, insert woke.
Some people would be like that. For the most part, I think not, but I think it's probably, in America and in the West, it's probably much less likely, significantly less likely that a doctor is going to broach those subjects because they're afraid of shaming their patient, when really they should be like, look, I'm just going to lay it out for you. Bang, bang, bang.
Right. So I think Wes was right on the money that a lot of the predisposed answers to the problems facing us is something that makes us feel good, but isn't really effective, So I bring it out with this. I'm not anti-vaccine, right? I
am.
but
I'm neither.
But here's the thing. But I believe you have to look at what is it for? Do I really need this? Is this something I'm going to be facing? So when I was in the Army, I got a shit ton of vaccines, and I remember everybody was sick for 3 days, right? But those vaccines worked, right? You don't change the definition of something just so that you can get emergency use authorization and enforce that, So I think what we're dealing with in what we're going around with is, why was all of this done, right? Why did we just go through 3 years of this? And I think a lot of people have a lot of ideas. This is one of the reasons I wanted you on, is that don't trust, verify. And I'd like to read this if I could. Don't Trust, Verify is an indispensable book for understanding the media in 2020s and beyond. The media has changed significantly. We don't know who or what to believe. And we often believe that things that we find out are later false. Should you believe that masks are necessary to keep children safe, or that they're harmful over time? Are gas prices increasing due to domestic choices or international shortages? Is the outrage of the day part of a larger, scarier trend, or is this just a trick to disregard us to get us to click? Most media literacy tries to explain how to identify media sources to trust, but this is totally wrong. All the reputable sources get things wrong every day. Even in fact checkers are regularly wrong and biased. Don't Trust, Verify is different. It explains why you should trust any of them. And so we got like 20 minutes left. So I want to ask your opinion on, you've given the Spanish-American War, which is awesome because I'm now in the Philippines, and we became an American colony. They became an American colony for a number of years because of it, and that was pretty much a, for lack of Alex Jones terming, false flag. We don't know, but the Gulf of Tonkin definitely was, right? And so these are things that changed the course of human history, right? They speak English here, not Spanish, and it's the national language. They have Tagalog and English. That's the national language. Things are done in English. And so with the Not Trust But Verify, what's the difference between attacking, let's say, and let's use Alex Jones, versus CNN for the Iraq WMDs versus all these other people that got things wrong. And let's look at the EU, for example, when they blatantly got Pfizer, when the Pfizer representative was asked that question by the EU, did you trust, did this transmit? And she goes, no, we were never tested, and we knew it didn't work. So
Yeah.
what do we do about that? So are we so programmed that people can't see the difference? You know what I mean? Like, how do we fix this? How do we?
So I'm trying to.
Let's unpack. I'm sorry.
Again, well, no, I don't know if it can be fixed, but I think if it is going to be fixed, it has to start just with each person doing what's best for them. You know, it goes back to what you said about, like, you know, social control versus allowing people to make their own choices. I think along with most social problems, and this is a social problem, we have to fix ourselves and help our neighbors figure out how to do it better themselves. And over time, maybe it'll get better, but I don't think there's a top-down approach that's going to fix this. You know, Kanye West just bought Parler, and I don't think that's going to change anything. I don't think Truth Social is going to change anything. I don't think there's top-down fixes for these things. I think there's certainly things you can do to make things better. You know, if Twitter and Facebook spent less time fact-checking and less time censoring, I think things would be better. But so going back to the individual, I think you have to find out what's important to you. So, you know, that example I gave of the AR-15 decapitating people, most people aren't going to spend the time to figure that out for themselves. And so, you know, if you really care about it, if you're maybe a gun person or you're just a media person, then you're going to spend the time on it. Most people won't. But if it's something that really matters to you, then maybe you will. And so you verify it. That's where the verification comes in. It's you've given me this information. I'm going to track down and find out if what you're saying is true. And if you give me information that isn't verifiable because it's, you know, sources close to the president, then I just disregard it. Be prepared again to say, I don't know. If sources close to the president said XYZ, okay, I don't care. And that's, I think, a mindset change that a lot of people struggle with, because they're like, but it's in the news and people are talking about it. I don't care. There's no verifiable information here for me to go on. So I'm not even going to consider whether or not it's true. I can't consider whether or not it's true. Now, I think a little bit differently maybe than most people, but that's how I operate, and I just disregard it. But if it is something I can verify and I care enough about it to spend the time on it, then I will dig in and find out what's true and what's not. I do this, you know, quite often. There was a survey the other day that said, you know, this was a particularly funny one. It said 25% or something of Hispanics, only 25% of Hispanics in the American workforce feel like they are fully included at their workplace. I followed that to a link to a story to the study, and found out from the study that actually out of all the groups they reported on, Hispanics actually felt the second most included. They tried to make it seem like Hispanics felt not included, and we needed to do something about this because Hispanics are so important to our workforce. But white men felt very unincluded. I think it was Asian, felt the least included, Asians in the American workforce. The people who felt the most included were LGBTQ people, felt the most included in the workforce. And so if anything,
it's because everyone's afraid.
Right, because everyone else is afraid to do anything. So it was remarkable that this story was just like, Hispanics don't feel included in the workforce, and we need to do something about it, when they felt the second most included.
Wow, that's interesting. So it's basically the repurposing of numbers. Wes, your thoughts?
Seems like they need to reassess who they were asking as well. And this is just an issue of basic statistics and data collection. So that's my go-to on that.
Yeah.
I mean, my thoughts, I got to tell you, one of the things I generally agree with, that if you want to assess the veracity of something, go and find the source. But what I was getting at earlier is that if you find the source, and in the case of like fact checking, when we discuss science, because that's what I've been censored about, is that there's a deeper heuristic at play, and is do you understand the methods used? Do you understand the statistics used? And actually, in fact, knowing a little bit of statistics, or I guess I should say like a little graduate level statistics, will get you quite far in determining if something is a good study or not.
Yeah.
And then you could just totally write off an entire field, right? Like the idea of like evidence-based medicine or like clinical epidemiology. Like if you understand how these things are run and statistically what they're trying to do, their motives, and then take a look at like do basic history lesson and understand pharmaceutical companies, the drugs that they actually get approved by the FDA.
Yeah.
Roughly some non-trivial percentage of them, I think it's like 20 some percent are, get pulled, right? Because they lack efficacy or they're dangerous.
Yeah.
But they pass the trials, right? So Wes, you're being very unscientific. Well, if you actually read into the data and actually understand the motives at play and the number crunching at play, and then given the context of a certain illness, at what time point an intervention was done and in what population and how they present the data and how they stratify the data in terms of people and subjects. Like if you just ask really basic questions and then do some really basic math, and it's a lot for some people, I agree, but then for scientists, I'd say most scientists should be able to do this.
Yeah.
You'll understand how you can just toss out certain studies and realize that a lot of it's bogus. And that's why we're in a replication crisis in science, because so certain people are just getting a pass and we're not questioning them. But we actually do need to not trust anymore. We need to just purely verify. And I honestly think that there needs to be more journals that just replicate studies to actually ascertain whether the scientific canon we're taught is actually true. For example, recently we found out that there's a major Alzheimer's study that was turned out to be fabricated, and a lot of research money was wasted on that. And we've wasted billions of dollars in the pharmaceutical industry because we've been chasing dead ends. Like that could have been avoided if we stopped.
I saw that story. It was amazing.
One of my former advisors would say, "Trust but verify, trust but verify." No, I stop trusting. Just purely verify. Question every scientist you meet, because frankly, everyone's pushing an agenda. I'm pushing an agenda. I want people to push back on my ideas, because if they don't, I don't learn anything. Right? Like there's no amount of people. I'm getting off on a tangent, but that's what I do.
No, but this
like
is
if
good.
you take five,
I don't think it is a tangent too much. Yeah, go ahead.
If you take 5 scientists in a room and we are all in the same subdiscipline, we all have read different papers. There's no 2 scientists in the same subdiscipline who work on the same technique have read the exact body of literature. It's impossible. Okay, we've maybe read the same textbooks, we maybe read we cite some of the same papers. But I'm going to approach something differently and think about certain things differently than someone else, right? So we take our own biases and our own background into our work and our own understanding of the literature into our work, right? And we generally understand how things work from some certain fundamental level, but the nuanced approach that we might put on interpretation and experimentation are going to be different. So we are supposed to disagree about things. Like that's how it's supposed to work. We have to disagree. If we don't disagree, we're not doing science. And that's it sounds shocking, but that's how it's got to be. Like I want people to tell me my ideas are wrong so that I can refine them and hone them. That's what truth is. And so if someone tries to fact check me, I'm going to first say, okay, what's your PhD in? What's your BS in? And then I know it sounds like credentialism, but if you've never pipetted something or written a line of code, you're not going to fact check me ever. You're beneath me.
Yeah,
and that's true. At least, and then you can go beyond that.
I would say that, like, if you made an error that someone is like, I have some background in science. I have really strong background in coding. But if I'm reading you, and in terms of statistics, it's undergraduate level. But if I'm reading your I would probably have the humility to come to you and ask you and say,
"Oh yeah,"
rather than fact check you, I would say, "This doesn't seem to add up to me. Am I missing something?"
That's important. That curiosity.
Yeah. Rather than come at you and say you're wrong because of this, unless it's clearly wrong, and I say, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're wrong. And here's if I'm absolutely sure, but you have to have a lot of humility with it. But
Oh yeah.
there's two kind of points that I was thinking of a James Madison quote from Federalist 10, where he says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Right? People are always going to be different because we're all fallible. And he goes on, as long as this connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. So he's talking about how it's this snowball effect of, I have these interests, and he gets into property rights and property interests and things like that. And there's people who have property have their interests. People who don't have property have separate interests. We have different thoughts. And journalists and scientists, they need to, first of all, have the humility to say, my opinion isn't necessarily the right one because I have my own perspective.
Right.
But he also has to recognize that respect his audience enough that they have to be able to come to their own conclusions based on the same evidence that you have. And it's that respect, I think, that is completely missing from most journalism today. I can't speak to scientific journals, but there's a complete lack of respect for the audience. It's just, this is what you should think, instead of saying, here's the information and let you think for yourself.
You can feel it, right?
Yeah.
You can feel that difference. Like, look at when, for example, and I hate to interrupt you, but I'm doing it.
No.
Glenn Greenwald, right? And how he speaks versus somebody from MSNBC, right? Glenn Greenwald, and he's got his own biases, his own opinions.
Absolutely.
But he speaks more with the audience and states and stuff like, hey, this is the people that are in power. This is what they're trying to shape. This is what's going on. That's why they're saying these things, right? Versus the talking heads that are funded by the deep state and intelligence community that are like war. And so I think the answer is we have to find a way to expose the difference between someone who's speaking with the audience and what Wes says in curiosity, right? So we have to start celebrating the idea of being curious about what you find disagreement with rather than attacking it, right? So, oh, that's right. Remember for social media, we'd be in Northern California. I was in Northern California. We'd have disagreements on politics. And it was always like the hippies were the libertarians. They're like pro speech, pro weed, pro everything, right? But we didn't fight, right? And here I am, a conservative. Yeah. We didn't fight. We sat there under the stars, smoked Humboldt green weed, and we listened to each other.
Yeah.
That entire culture is Gen X. The rest of it is like it's now become talking points in mental programming based on TikTok algorithms. I think we got to get back to that curiosity that Wes is talking about. So you talk about staying in the question, right? And not being convinced. And I think that's the biggest outcome of don't trust. Just stay in the question. You don't lose anything if you're staying in the question. And as Wes says, have curiosity. So stay in the question. All right. So my grandfather said, Kevin, always back the horse in the race called selfish or self-interest. It's the only one telling the truth.
Yeah.
Very true.
So, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so I'll give you a moment to wrap up. We've got like 3 minutes each.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you are interested in the book, you can go to verified.nandor.org, NANDOR. That's my last name, verified.nandor.org. And I'm putting up portions of the book on my private Substack. If you pre-order, you can get access to the Substack. And I'm hoping to actually in the next few weeks to get out the whole first part of the book and get that. Again, the first part of the book is more about kind of history and a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of psychology and I want to get that out. Also, I go through and explain like how logical deductive arguments work. What creates an unsound argument or an invalid argument, so that people can, tools that people can, and not using like my kids are going through this and they're like, if P then X, and they're like, I have no idea what. I'm not using. I'm trying to write it in a way that that teenagers can consume it as well, because you know, they're the ones. I've got 3 teenagers right now. Well, one of them actually is early 20s now. But you know, giving them tools. And so I'm trying. So before I get into the meat of the book of, you know, here's examples of you know, how to lie via juxtaposition and how they do all these different things, their tactics, just giving the basics. And so I'm hoping to get that first part of the book out in onto the Substack in hopefully within a few weeks. There's a lot left to do, but I've got most of it formed in some shape. So anyways, yeah, and that's it. This book really is exciting to me because I think there is such a need for it and people want it. And I know I want some of the tools that I'm writing, right? Because it's like being able to write some of this out makes me think of it more clearly so that then I can use that as well. So it's helping me.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, dude. Wes, your
Thank you.
final words. I'll give you final word.
Yeah, really great to have you. And I learned a fair bit about the history of misinformation, and really feel like there's a lot to dig in there, especially about, you know, our American media, same tactics over and over again. Like, I had no idea about the reason or the rationale or concocted rationale for conflict with Spain, things like that. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to also mention, yeah, this idea about constructing a heuristic for knowing whether something is real or not. I've always been trying to do that, and spotting these things in papers, in scientific papers, has really helped me. Like you mentioned, like juxtapositions of ideas that are not necessarily logically coherent. Just the author wants to have a justification to say something else, and or like in the media, framing someone with certain language, or like Russell conjugations to make them look worse than they are or look better than they are. And these sort of things are really, you know, psychological tactics that are just employed all the time. I think it's great that you're trying to show people that that sort of primer is necessary for the modern world. I wish I had a way to say these things myself. Oftentimes I just say, oh, this guy's just full of it's just a crock, you know, and then I come to my realization, you know, why do I think that later? But oftentimes there's just all these, you know, red herrings and stuff thrown around by people, and, you know, gish gallop of stuff. So I definitely hope the word gish gallop gets thrown in there at some point in your book. Yeah, that's one of my favorite bogus argumentation techniques, that it's not necessarily in the media, but it is in like argumentation. And that's another thing, is that the media is a form of rhetoric now, like argumentation, that it's like you're constantly having to try to deal with someone trying to convince you of something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very good point.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my piece.
Okay, you stopped it right there, like in the middle of a sentence. So it was almost like a like when you hear another dialect and they stop when the inflection of the voice goes up. I'm still waiting for it.
Sorry.
So, everybody, thank you for listening to Dangerous PH. I definitely would like to have Chris back in the future, especially after he's done, and talk about things, because it was really good insight. I appreciate your time, Chris. Check out verify.nandor.org. And I threw a screenshot up there, and I'll put the link in the description below. And you guys have a good day. Thank you very much.